You know what, Dawn? When we talk about these principles, don't they apply to livestock too? Why did Bud tell you to take those calves for a walk? If they were stressed, didn't they need a state change? Didn't they need to be able to relieve some stress?
They certainly did.
Yeah. And so we get it. We get what stress does to cattle, right?
Yeah.
We're no different. We're just, yeah, like most people don't like when I compare them to cows, but really, it's kind of how it goes. We are grateful to have Dawn Hnatow here with us. I asked her to speak specifically on this summit because it pains me to see when people farm and ranch and livestock is integrated in that, but livestock is one of the biggest stressors that they have. Like sometimes they sleep the night before they have to go work cattle. And sometimes when they're working cattle, it's just a yelling match between the family. Um, I mean, I've seen that on other operations, over the fence. Okay, maybe I've been there a time or two too. All all transparency. And so we don't want it to be that way. If we're going to have a legacy business, I encourage you to integrate livestock. And stockmanship is such a key piece to be able to do that, not only for the health and well-being of the livestock, but also for our own health and well-being. And so kind of to that end, that's why I felt inspired to reach out to Dawn and to ask her to speak on this summit today. And so Dawn, we're super grateful that you're willing to be here. And
Well, I'm super grateful to be asked. It's an honor, Jared. Thank you.
yeah, Dawn, you had the opportunity, probably more so than anybody outside of Bud Williams' family, to get to know Bud Williams as a person and get to work and get to learn from him firsthand. And I know when you visited our ranch last fall, we talked about some of the stories that I hadn't heard about Bud. Um, and so I'm really grateful that you're continuing to perpetuate the legacy. Um, I don't know. Does anybody in here not know who Bud Williams is? Uh, Great stockman, kind of the founder of the sell by marketing principles. Um, super great guy. People either he was kind of had a people either loved him or hated him. It's kind of he was kind of polarizing by his attitude. I happen to be one of the ones who loved him, one of the latter, because I
Yeah.
think he knew, and particularly one experience when I was called him up to get advice and I was kind of beaten up on myself and he just stopped me mid-sentence. He said, Jared, that's enough. There's enough people that are going to beat up on you. You don't do it to yourself. And he was direct. And I will always remember that because it wasn't done with condemnation. It was done with a level of respect and I think even love. So
I do.
nothing else. We can tell some stories. Let's talk about some stockmanship principles and I mean you can kind of walk through what you were going to do on your presentation as if you were
Sure.
presenting, talk us through it. So yeah, we've got like 50 minutes and we'll roll.
Okay. Well, first of all, Jared, thank you so much for sharing your story with everyone. I think it's important that we keep an eye out for one another and stay keenly aware of how our friends are doing because it's not always easy, and it's good to know you're not alone. So thank you for sharing that with everyone. And I think for me, that's what Bud did for animals. What Dave and your other friend did for you there is what Bud felt for and did for animals, which was to try to give them a voice in this conversation and make it such that we could communicate with them in a way that they could understand and would allow us to not just have to force everything to be done. So much of what I learned from Bud came in the way that I learned to change the way I think about things. And that's not just about stock handling, that's about life in general. The necessity to try to get along and find a peaceful path through all of these things that we have to navigate. And as ranchers, we have a lot of stressors. I mean, we've got weather, we've got market fluctuations, we have all of these things that we don't have a lot of control over. And unfortunately, for most of us, that included our stock and the way that they were handled and what, all of the difficulties we typically have in getting jobs done. And for me, when you were talking about what it's like on ranches for families, it made me kind of laugh because it brought back, I have this vivid memory of, my dad was a rancher and farmed a little bit of grain, and things were always tight and difficult and tough. And on the days that it was time to gather cattle, he was so stressed that he could barely function. He got up every day, every morning, and all of the animals we fed with a team at that time. The team, the saddle horses, the milk cows, all of that got fed before we had breakfast. And he enjoyed that every other morning of the year, except when it was time to work the livestock, to gather or do whatever, wean, whatever we were going to do. And he was mad before he ever left the house in the morning. So the first thing that would happen is he couldn't catch the horses, which is clue number one. The day was not going to go well. So, we'd leave out. It'd be my dad, my mom, my sister, me, and a dog or two. And pretty soon, mom would go back to the house. Then my sister would go back to the house. Then the dogs would leave. And there'd be me and dad out there just slugging away, trying to get the job done, and I was passionate enough about the stock and, wanted to help enough that I tolerated all of the, oh my goodness, it was just so stressful, just unbelievably stressful. And I think that is a common thing. And it's so sad because it's not necessary. After I'd started working with Bud, it got difficult to go back and work under those conditions again. So I kept telling my dad, look, now if I'm going to come and help here, you need to keep yourself under control here. Like, don't lose your temper. Let's figure out a way to get this done. And we were out gathering the cows one day, and I'm trying to direct him to go do something. And he halfway did it, but not quite. And so the animals turned the wrong way instead of the way we were trying to go. And he's like, this doesn't work. I told you this wouldn't work. He said, no, Dad. We were trying to turn left. Now you know how to turn right. Like, just calm down, So, yeah, I think what I really was wanting to talk about in this session more than anything was the idea that we have to view our stock as sentient beings, that animals are capable of learning. And in most cases, it's us that has the problem and not the animals. Cesar Millan talks about how people don't have dog problems, dogs have people problems. It's very similar in the case of livestock, because our instincts as humans are quite predatory, and they don't work when you're trying to get things done with animals. So, I spent about 12 years working with Bud every day. Most of that in a feed yard in Canada, and then for a couple of years after I moved to Texas on a fairly good sized cow-calf operation. And everything that we did centered around understanding some very innate behavioral concepts in these animals that we don't necessarily acknowledge as humans. We tend to think that we need to overpower and dominate and control these animals and force them to do whatever it is that we want them to do. And sometimes we succeed at that, and sometimes we don't. We pay a big price for it when we do, even though Like Bud used to say, just because somebody doesn't run up and grab $300 or $400 out of your pocket doesn't mean you didn't just flush it down the toilet by the way you handled your cattle. Speaking specifically of shrink, Colorado State University says that cattle will shrink 1% per hour just standing quietly in a pen. And oftentimes, when the gathers go badly, they can lose up to 10% of their weight. So if you think about that in terms of dollars and cents, that's a huge hit to take. If you're looking at 800-pound steers right now coming off, well, not right now, but at the price they are right now, if they were coming off grass at 800 pounds and you were accepting a 7% shrink, that's going to cost you $56,000 just because those animals were not handled correctly. Now, Bud talked a lot about teaching these animals to do the things that we need for them to do all the way through the production process on our places, and it's the same for cows, for sheep, for goats, any of those livestock animals. Even I've heard some people say they've tried it on people and it even works, that you can, some of these principles are very, they're very effective. And so if, you wouldn't take a 2-year-old colt that you'd never saddled before and tie his front foot to a tree and throw a saddle on and then turn him loose and go gather your yearlings because the trucks are going to be there in 2 hours. You wouldn't take a dog that you've never worked before to go do that job. You'll spend several $1,000s training those animals so that you can use them in that context. But who thinks about training the cattle? Who thinks about taking the time to work with those animals so that they clearly understand what they're being asked to do, and you can communicate in a way that's very effective? I mean, I saw Bud do things with livestock that I still can't believe, and I was standing right there and watched it. And there was no force, no fear, no coercion involved. It was all him using their instinct to his advantage. So he used to always say, if you pay attention, the animals will tell you where you need to be to get them to do what you want them to do. So something I noticed, when I first started teaching, which is more years ago now than I care to acknowledge, it really bothered me as I was going around the country that I didn't see very many kids on ranches. The kids had left home. They'd gone on. They went to school. They chose to do other things. Most of them that I talked to said they just couldn't. It wasn't a life that they wanted to live. It was too stressful and too difficult. And I think a big part of that was all of the anxiety and tension around handling the stock, and all the other things that you've been talking about earlier, in combination, just didn't make it look like a very good way to go. I'm glad to say that with this regenerative movement that's been coming on pretty strong, that's starting to change. I'm starting to see young people back on the ranches again, and young people wanting to stay and continue on with it. I think it's really difficult in a 1 hour space of time to tell you how to do all of these things and do them efficiently. But I think if you can change the way you think such that you look at these animals as something that needs to be taught what to do, and if you can learn to read them in such a way as you understand that they don't like to be pushed from behind, You know, we as humans like to get behind these animals and shove on them, push directly in from behind to get them to move. And if you watch what happens when you do that, and you know, if I had my video up, I'd be able to show this very clearly. As soon as you start pushing straight in from behind, they start to turn their head to try to pick up where you are because they can't see you anymore. And if you watch people, when somebody walks directly up behind you, that's uncomfortable to me. I'll turn too and see, what are you doing back there? And it's probably most effectively demonstrated by on the highway driving. You know, if you're on a 2-lane highway or a 4-lane highway, sorry, and you look in your rearview mirror and there's a vehicle coming quickly in the lane beside you, and you know they're going to go past, it doesn't bother you very much. But if they're coming from directly behind and they're going faster than you are and they're gaining ground, that starts to make my blood pressure come up. You know, so it's those kinds of things that we need to remember and understand about these animals and what it is that they need from us in order to do what we want. They need to see where it is that you want them to go. They would prefer always to go by or around you rather than turn around and walk away from you, especially if you're pushing straight in from behind. If you pressure them into a dead end, they want to turn around and come back where they came from, which is the whole principle that spawned the bud box, which, you know, bud boxes are now all over the country and maybe all over the world by now. And that's because Bud figured out that when those animals hit a dead end, the first thing that they're going to do instinctively is to turn around and try to go back because they don't want to be trapped in there. That's the way he thought. That was his power of observation. And, you know, I've told this story several times, but when I first moved to Bowie, to Texas, he and Eunice were living on the ranch that I was working on, and he came out most days to help me do things that I was doing there. And we were walking back from moving a set of cattle, and we came face to face with a coyote on a 2-track. We were on foot walking. And he proceeded to mess with that coyote. And he turned that thing in a circle to the right, just like a reining horse. I mean, the thing turned around one way and then it turned around the other. And then it would walk away a little ways and then turn around and look at him again. And all the time he's just shifting his body, maybe even his weight from one foot to the other. And he had a smile on like you can't imagine, because he was just jacking with this poor thing. It didn't know what it was supposed to do. And finally, it just turned around and looked at him and then took off on the dead run. It was like, you're screwing with my brain. I need to get out of here. But that's the kind of stuff he did. He just wanted to see and try to understand what that animal was responding to and how it would respond. So he spent a lot of time watching the stock, cattle and sheep and goats mostly, and he learned to pay attention to how they reacted to the way he pressured them. And he came to figure out that these behaviors are very predictable. And you can gain a lot of control and a lot of, just an easy flow with your stock if you can learn to do some of those things. It's what allowed him to be dumped off in the tundra in Alaska and gather 1,500 head of reindeer with a snow machine and 2 dogs and drive them right down the main street of a village up there and into a holding facility because somebody told him it couldn't be done, which was the first thing you should never have said to Bud Williams. You know, there were no ceilings for him because he knew he could figure it out. Bud never imagined, he dwelled in possibility all the time. There was never, I can't, it won't work, we can't do this. It was always, There is a way to get it done. We just have to figure out what that is. So I was so blessed and so privileged to have spent the time that I did with him. He came to Canada to a feed yard that I was working at, and we had pretty much stopped buying weaned calves there, or bringing in weaned calves, because it was, the death loss was too high. It was too stressful for the staff. We had weather issues. We were the northernmost feedlot in North America at that time. And after Bud came, we were buying fresh weaned calves, multi-source, high-risk calves from all over the country, and doing it with, a 1% death loss, which was unheard of at that time. And even now, I think industry average is about somewhere between 5 and 8% death loss on weaned calves. If you think about that in terms of dollars, that's an astronomical loss, especially in a market like this. And all we did differently was we handled the cattle differently. We took care of them differently. And I think, for a lot of us, the idea of just putting feed in the bunk and making sure they have water, and if you're in the northern part of the hemisphere, bedding and all of those things, we feel like we've done all we can. Vaccines, proactively treating with antibiotics, all of the things that we do because we think that's what keeps the animals alive. And in fact, that's not necessarily the case. If those animals are so stressed that they can't eat, if you think about it logically, when people talk about teaching calves to eat when they go to the feed yard, well, my goodness, they're probably 500 pounds. Don't you think they've eaten before? They probably don't need to be taught to eat. The question is, what have we done to them psychologically that makes them refuse to eat perfectly good feed? I mean, there's a good chance they've never seen feed as good as what they'll get in most feed yards. And yet they won't eat it. They'll go 3, 4, 5 days sometimes and not eat. Why? It's stress, just like people. And back to your comment about the walk. How do you help somebody through a stressful situation? Well, you spend some time with them. You go for a walk. You go eat with them. You go get something to drink. You do all of the things that should help make them feel better mentally. And very shortly after Bud got there, I remember this very clearly, and Eunice talks about it a lot, about, the feeding, the software program for the feed actually could not believe that brand newly arrived calves could eat as much feed as they were eating. Like, you couldn't input that amount of feed because it's like, no, they're only supposed to eat 3 pounds and they're eating 6. Something's wrong. Like, that can't happen. But it did. And it happened over and over and over again. And it was 100% because we spent the majority of our time working with those calves and making them feel comfortable. And when they feel comfortable, they'll go eat and drink. Because, in my opinion, a big majority of these losses we suffer in feed yards and even on our own ranches at weaning time come as a result of starvation. I mean, they might die from pneumonia, but it's because their system is just so run down and worn out that they can't mount any kind of a fight against it. So the big key is to make sure that these animals can and will eat and drink. The drugs, to my mind, are a secondary factor. The vaccines, same thing. my goodness, we lose a lot of vaccinated cattle still. So that's not the be all and end all. All of the additives we put in feed, all of these things certainly may help if they eat them. And that's the big issue, right? It's it doesn't always work because they don't always eat it. So we spent most of our time either walking those calves, taking them for a walk down the feed alley, or putting them in an empty pen, just take them for a walk. It was absolutely remarkable what a difference that made to the calves. We think it doesn't matter, but it mattered greatly to them. And, you know, he just, he was a remarkable man. He really was. It was.
Be a good time to interject a quick question here on receiving.
Yeah.
So Caleb asked a good question, something that I've definitely not mastered, but how to settle a new pen of calves. And so he says, I studied stockmanship for a few years now and still haven't satisfactorily settled new calves. So kind of that first exposure when the cattle come either off, I guess the context would probably be here, Caleb, right after they're weaned. Oh,
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I didn't move my microphone. Context here. Thank you for letting me know. Context here would be probably right after they wean or right after they come onto the ranch. And what's kind of the steps that you would do?
Okay, so a couple of things right off the bat that are very contrary to what we think conventionally, and that's about your feed and water. Bud was very adamant that you never drive the cattle to their feed. Okay, so rather than trying to get behind them and drive them up to the bunk or drive them over to the hay or whatever it is you're feeding them, it's best to take those calves and pressure them against the back of the pen and let them come by you toward the feed. So what you're trying to do is create a pressure-free zone around the feed. That's where you want them to feel safest. Does that make sense? So rather than going and getting them up or getting behind them, getting them out of the corner and trying to take them up to the feed, actually pressure them away from it and let them come by and out. And that, because that serves one of these tenets I was talking about that Bud figured out about these animals, which is that they far prefer to come by or around you rather than to be pushed from behind. Now, I'm not saying you can't drive cattle from behind. I do it all the time, but there's some very specific things that you have to understand about that. Now, if you're bringing your calves in and they're walking around the pen, pacing around, they're not eating, they're not drinking, they're not laying down, the first thing that I do with those calves is just get in there with them and walk parallel with the movement as it's going. Because if you walk forward parallel with movement, you tend to slow it down. That's one of the other of Bud's rules or observations. As you walk with them, they will slow down. And then as they come into a corner, you have to back up a little bit and let them come out because you're not trying to block them or stop them from moving. So if you slam them into the corner, what'll happen is they'll turn around and go back the way they came, but they'll bang into one another, and that just creates more anxiety and stress. So we're wanting to let this flow go, but we're trying to slow it down such that they decide to stop. And, you know, people struggle with this notion because it's like, well, you know, what do you want me to do? Sing Kumbaya to them or what? But what you're doing is trying to get control of their mind. It's not just their feet that you need to worry about. It's their mindset. You want them to be comfortable to slow down. And you need to do that, you know, maybe for just short periods of time. They have a very short attention span. So 10 minutes maybe, but do it as often as you can over that first day. And then eventually they'll slow down. And then you can start driving them and doing things with them after that. The first thing you really need to do is to get them to calm down and relax so that they'll eat and drink and lay down. I think one of the things that we really miss with these calves is how tired they are, how worn out they are, and that's what stress does to you, right? It just takes all the life out of you. They need to feel comfortable enough to lay down, and they need to feel comfortable enough to go up and stick their head in a feed bunk because they may not have ever done that before. So that's a very simplistic explanation of that. Bud would never allow anyone to film him settling a new pen of calves because he said, they're all different. Every group is different. You can't do exactly the same thing with every group of animal. But if you are willing to spend the time with them and just walk with them and let them calm down, you'll gain a lot of ground. So those are the two things that I would suggest you work on first, is learn how to slow those animals down and get them to quit pacing. And then the second thing to remember is around the feed. If you can just walk them to the back of the pen or the pasture or wherever you are, pressure them lightly against the back, and then just let them come out and let them head toward the feed and water. Pretty soon they'll find out that's a really good place to be. When Bud came, I think it was the second or third winter he was there. It was a brutally cold winter there, and he would go out early, at 5:30 in the morning before the rest of the crew got there, and get all the cattle up and to send them up to eat whatever feed might have been left in the bunk, if there was any. And at that time of year and that kind of cold, he had to go down there with a shovel and chip it off the concrete bunks, off the bottom of them. It was cold and frozen. And after about a month of that, all he had to do was drive his pickup down the alley, and all the cattle got up and went to the feed bunk. They learned what was expected of them and what they were supposed to do. They all got up and went to the bunk, and he never even got out of the truck. So they learn to do these things if it's presented to them in the right way. Now, had he gone in there with the dogs and chased him up there and tried to hold him up against the bunk and made him eat frozen silage, the minute he left, they would have been at the back of the pen again. But he did it in such a way that it was their idea, and they were happy to go up there. So then, from there, the walking, the change of scenery, the stimulation, if you think about what happens to these calves when they're weaned, their mother has pretty much told them everything that needed to be done during the day. They follow her, go where she goes. Now suddenly she's gone, and they're in a pen with a bunch of other juvies that don't know what they're supposed to be doing either. So there's no leader anymore. There's no there's no order. There's no comfort. There's nothing. So we need to replace that, and hopefully you can replace that with a good handler. And when you do that, then it's amazing. I'm sorry we couldn't get the video up. I have some really good video to show you of the things that are possible with these animals when they're handled in a way that they understand and are comfortable with. There's almost nothing. I mean, Bud and Eunice loaded cattle off the Aleutian Islands onto barges with no corrals. So the barge would come in, the tide would go out, they'd lower the gangplank, Bud and Eunice would go out, gather up a group of animals, walk them out into the water, and they would jump on that gangplank and go onto the ship with no panels, no fence, and there's photographic and video evidence of it being done. All because The backstory was they spent several weeks training those animals to be driven. There were a bunch of old bridges that the Army had built on that island many years prior. Eunice said some of them, half the boards had rotted out. And, Bud would go gather these wild cattle off the island there and work with them until he could get them to walk across those bridges and step over the planks that were broken. And that was the preparation that they did to be able to load them on the boat. So had you gone the day the ship showed up and tried to chase them on there, well, I think we all know what would have happened, right? Just doesn't work.
What would you say, Dawn, is the, I don't know, the most susceptible cattle, the most at-risk cattle that a typical cow-calf producer has, or the time at which, you really need to have your stockmanship on, your game on?
Well, what I would really like to say about that, Jared, is that you prepare to wean your calves before they're even born. And by that, I mean, you need to work with your cows, because those cows are the very first teachers that those babies will have. And so if you work with your cows and teach them to be handled properly and teach them to do all the, the things that you're going to need for them to do while they're in your system, that just makes it so much easier than when you get to the calves and have to wean them. Now, I think something that is a misconception is that the wilder cattle are the biggest problem. That has not necessarily been my experience. Sometimes those really blubbery, fat, gentle calves kind of fall apart when you wean them. And I think probably the root of that is that obviously they've had a really good mother, because they're big and fat and shiny, and she's taken excellent care of them all their life, and everything's been rosy. And then suddenly they're like, what do you mean I can't have milk anymore? What are you talking about? That's what I do. What's wrong with you people? Sometimes those calves are a little harder to get on feed than the ones that are a little wilder. And I think at the root of that is, those spookier cattle tend to have a really strong survival instinct. They pay attention. They're watching all the time. Well, in that, they're as likely, at least, to eat and to stay alive as a calf that's had a really plush, easy life, and then suddenly can't get what they want or have what they want, and they sulk. Those are tougher to bring around, I think. As far as the risk, overall risk, obviously, if you're buying calves, fresh weaned calves coming through a sale barn, multi-source calves, that's going to be your biggest challenge. And it's not one that can't be met. We did it very successfully in Canada at that feed yard after we learned how to commingle them, for one thing, and more importantly, how to get them to where they would eat right off the truck, like the night they arrive. And once we got in the swing of that, that really wasn't an issue anymore. We bought all kinds of high risk cattle and really didn't have any more trouble with them than we did with any other group. So
yeah, good answer. And we've got about 13 minutes left here, Dawn. Let's talk a little bit about how people can learn, because obviously Bud's no longer with us, and we're so grateful that you and others, some are on this summit that teach classes as well. If somebody's passionate about stockmanship, which we all should be if we have cattle, right? I mean, it's kind of like saying, well, I'm going to go be a doctor, and I just show up and they say, okay, here's your certificate. You're a doctor. We think that we can just buy a ranch and all of a sudden have a certificate to be a rancher. We should learn. we should learn
Right.
learn stockmanship. So what would you recommend, and tell a little bit about your schools and how they connect with you?
Well, I think obviously there's a lot to this stuff. It isn't just, it requires a dedication. It requires that you genuinely want to learn to do better, and it requires that you actually genuinely care about the animals. I think those are the important things to know before you embark on the journey, because it's all about understanding from the animal's perspective what's going on, why they're doing what they're doing, what we can do to mitigate that. And, a stockmanship school, a course, Tina and Richard McConnell teach stockmanship schools. Tina is Bud's daughter, and Richard McConnell is her husband. They do some online stockmanship courses that I think are very good as an introduction to the ideas and concepts. I do stockmanship schools as well, and on ranch consults. My schools are usually 2-day indoor initially, which is a sort of a stockmanship 101. We go into there's 12 basic principles of animal behavior that we talk about. There's 6 or 7 very important techniques and ideas that Bud talked about, that if you can implement them correctly will get you out of almost any jam you might find yourself in terms of handling. So those are usually 2-day schools. And then I also I'll do field days, where it's half classroom, half hands-on. I like to I'll help people in any way I can. So if people want an indoor school, which I think is the best route to go initially, just to get the exposure and understand the concepts and principles, and then go to work on live cattle, which is we do also intermediate schools, which requires that you attend a beginner one first. We do more live cattle at those intermediate schools, where we can start to apply the principles and techniques on live animals. So yeah, there's Whit Hibbard. Unfortunately, Whit has kind of gone into semi-retirement, but Whit did as good a job as anybody possibly could of these introductory stockmanship clinics. And so I'll probably be actually teaching that clinic some as well.
Okay.
And then obviously I put together custom clinics for clients for whatever it is that they feel like they need to work on or learn or do.
Well, Russell asks a pretty unique question. Do you teach a class for teenagers, Dawn?
I do.
I mean, how to manage teenagers, I think, is what he's asking.
Well, I actually, no, I think the principles apply.
I know. But no, you are open to having youngsters come to your classes, right? As long as
oh my goodness,
by a parent.
yes,
by a parent.
Absolutely. And any kid, I don't care how young they are, they're welcome to come. I'm very happy to have them.
Yeah.
In fact, that really makes me happy.
Oh yeah. When you came out last fall, we had all the younger kids out there, and it was just pretty cool for them to be able to experience about driving cattle and build some confidence there, which, I mean, our kids are good horsemen, and
Sure.
With a horse you can make up for a lot of mistakes, but sometimes you've got to get on foot, right? And walk long ways and have that time to think about, why did this just happen, instead of having the horse to bail you out.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And I would say that initially, when you very first start learning this stuff, you are better off on foot. just because it leaves no doubt about where the mistakes were made. It had no, your horse didn't do anything wrong. No, your dog didn't do anything wrong. You were there. This is what happened, and this is why. And you can see that very clearly if you're there alone.
Yeah.
Now, let's get real. When you're on 20,000 acres, nobody's going to walk out there to go do anything like that. But while you have the opportunity and have cattle in the pens or around the yard or whatever, that's a really good opportunity to work some on foot and just really watch how they respond to pressure and practice. And, you know, when I get a new set of cattle in, I want them to be able to do all the things that they're going to do for the entire time that they're there. And while their little feet are moving and they have all that innate movement in them, why not let them run through the chute on a dry run? Leave the head gate open and just let them run through there. Why not run them over your scale with the gates open? Just let them go up and in and through it and over. Move them from pen to pen, back and forth. Let them move their feet. Let them, and then they'll start to slow down. And then all of these things that you have to do later are no big deal. They've already done it. And they don't forget. If it's not a horrible, stressful situation, they have no reason to not go through easily. That was a total new idea that Bud presented up there. I mean, we'd never thought about doing anything like that. And then we thought about it a lot because it made a really big difference.
Perfect. I just shared your website. Oh, I meant to share that with the whole group. I just shared it in a private message. So we're going to do this. So it is cattleupstockmanship.com, right?
That's correct.
And yeah,
Facebook, same thing. Facebook
is the same thing. Okay.
Yep.
Kind of as we close here, is there a favorite story from working with Bud that you'd like to share, Dawn?
Oh gosh, there's so many, Jared, but I think one that comes to mind, one of my favorites, because it was very early on when Bud first came to the feed yard. And it was, you know, it was in the fall, and it was probably 4:30 or so in the afternoon, and I had finished up doing whatever it was I had to do at the feedlot, and we're winding the day down, getting ready to go home. You know, mostly we left at 5 o'clock, and it was about 4:30, and I came down the alley toward the office, and there was a truck backed in unloading a load of cattle, and all of a sudden I saw a steer jump over one of those 8-foot tall fences, and he took off out into thank goodness he went out into a silage field out behind the feedlot, not down the county road. And shortly thereafter, I saw Bud come out of the office, and I knew where he was going. He was going to get that steer. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, do I go try to help, or am I going to make this so much worse? But I couldn't not go try to help him. Well, long story short, after about 7 or 8 trips around that 400-acre silage field, and him speaking very sternly to me about all the things I was doing wrong and why it wasn't going well, and why wouldn't I do what I knew I needed to do? You know the way Bud talked, Jared, that confused people a little bit. He's spoken hyperbole a lot. Finally, my feet were so sore and blistered, and I was so tired, I finally just tuned out my entire brain and did exactly what he told me. And the calf went through the gate. It was in the middle of a fence. It was a bit of a difficult deal. And so the calf walked through the gate, and I walked up there, and I bent over and put my hands on my knees, and I mean, I was about done. And he started to laugh, and he walked up behind me, and he said, yeah, I guess you'll make a hand. I guess he meant this because I didn't quit and go home. I was like, gee, thanks. Is that what it's going to take? every day for me to do this. And I did it many, many, many times. You know, people talk about Bud being difficult to get along with and a bit fractious. Let me just say that it takes a certain kind of person and a certain personality to be willing to take somebody day after day who makes your job 1,000 times harder and still just keep plugging away with you, you know? I mean, it's like Mozart trying to teach a 5-year-old to play the piano. I can't imagine how frustrating it must have been. And yet he never told me I couldn't go.
Yeah.
So I've appreciated that very much about him, and more so all the time as I'm trying to teach myself. When I realize how frustrated he must have been at how many times, you know, I screwed up when I should have known better. And he just kept on coming every day. So
Yep.
I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, I am as well, Dawn. We appreciate that you jumped on here. No worries about the technical difficulties. We'll edit that out and it'll be just fine. It's a great conversation, and I encourage our
Thank you, Jared.
attendees to check out what Dawn does. She is really qualified to teach this material because she's paid the price to become an expert at it, and she has the experience to back it up. And so thank you very much, Dawn, for being part of the summit here.
Thank you very much, Jared. And thank you to everyone on your team that helped get it organized. I appreciate it. Hope to see you all somewhere down the road.